Question. When you scroll through your timeline and you hit one of those African or general gender discourse posts, you know the ones, does what you see look like two sides trying to understand each other, or does it look like two groups of people who have genuinely decided that the other is the enemy? Because if you spend any time in those social media spaces, you already know exactly what I'm talking about. The posts, the threads, the comment sections that somehow always end up in the same place, men and women at each other's throats, both sides convinced that the other is destroying something sacred. It is exhausting to watch, isn't it? And the reason I wanted to make this episode is that I think most of us can feel at some level that something about that whole fight is off, that we are arguing over the wrong things, that the real conversation is somewhere underneath all of it. This episode is about what that real conversation looks like, and about what our ancestors understood at the level of belief, of spirituality, of how they designed society itself, about what we have largely stopped remembering. I grew up in a loosely Christian African household, and like most people who grew up in a Christian household anywhere in the world, I absorbed a very specific set of ideas about gender, indirectly, without any formal type of teaching. God was a man, that much was clear. Jesus was a man. The head pastors, the ones with real authority, whose words carried weight in the room, were almost always men. And the doctrine or saying that held all of it together, the one I heard more times than I can even count, was the man is the head of the household. Right. That single line did a lot of work. It organized the family, it organized the church, it organized who leads, who follows, who decides, and who supports the person who decides. The same book described the woman as the helper. And that word, helper, is not a bad word on its own. In fact, it's neutral. There's nothing wrong with helping. But within a belief system that already has ranked God above man and man above woman, the word helper loses whatever neutrality it started with. It starts to mean something smaller, something that fills in the gap around the real thing. And where did this belief system actually come from? Because it wasn't ours initially. It was brought to us by missionaries, by foreign administrators, by a Victorian-era version of religion that had its own very specific ideas about the natural order of things. Those ideas organized everything into a strict ranking. One god at the top, male, then the king, then the husband, then the wife. Valued, yes, but only within very specific conditions. That ranking system was not ours, but it has been here long enough that it can feel like it was. Okay, let's go somewhere else entirely. What if I told you that many of our ancestors had a completely different understanding of how masculine and feminine relate to each other? One where the question of which one is superior was never even asked. Not because it was avoided, but because within their worldview, the question made no sense. That is not a romantic idea. That is what historical record actually shows. In Yoruba cosmology, the divine world reflects the human world, and in that world, power is never held by one force alone. It is always held in relationship. Obatala, the cool, calm energy of creation and wisdom, exists alongside Yemoja, the vast protective energy of motherhood and survival. Shango, the fire of justice, is balanced by Oshun, the flowing energy of love, fertility, and diplomacy. Neither of these forces is above the other, and Neither can overpower the other without throwing everything into disarray. This is a practical framework for how power has to be shared to actually work. It is not something abstract. It is governance. And running through all of Yoruba philosophy is a concept called Iwa Pele. Iwa Pele means gentle, balanced character. The Yoruba consider this the highest thing a human being could develop in their lifetime. And here's the part that I want you to hold. Iwa Pele had no gender. It was not something expected of women and optional for men, for example. It was the standard the entire community was measured by. Every person, man or woman, was expected to work towards achieving that internal balance. Think about what that does to the relationship between men and women. In a society where even the gods modeled balance and where the highest human goal is to be balanced within yourself, competition between genders does not just become unnecessary, it becomes pointless. It's like asking whether breathing in is more important than breathing out. The question has no answer because both are part of the same thing. Now let's move to the Akan people of West Africa, predominantly found in today's Ghana. Because here, the philosophy goes even further. They built it into how they understand the human body itself. The Akan believe a person is made up of two essential equally important forces. The Mogya, the blood, which you receive entirely from your mother, connects you to your lineage, your family, your place in the world. Because of this, Akan society passes power and inheritance through women. Then there is Sunsum, the spirit, the personality, which you receive from your father. This shapes who you are and how you move through life. Without the Mogya, you have no roots, no family, no belonging. Without the Sunsum, you have no inner life, no drive, no self. You cannot have one without the other. It is a 50-50, and the entire society was built around understanding that both are equal and both are necessary. And then there is Ubuntu, the Southern African principle that most of us know as I am because we are. But what that phrase is really saying runs deeper than it sounds. In a community genuinely living by Ubuntu, one person dominating another is not just wrong, it works against the person doing the dominating. Because if my humanity is connected to yours, then undermining you undermines me. When gender becomes a ranking system in that framework, the whole community pays for it, men and women both. These were not ideals held by a few thinkers somewhere on the edges. They were the foundations entire civilizations were built on. The beliefs that shaped governance, family life, and how communities understood themselves. So how did we get from that to where we are now? Well, it didn't happen by accident. It wasn't one event. It came in layers, deliberately over time, and what it went after first was the most powerful thing that it could target, what people believed was sacred. When foreign administrators and missionaries arrived carrying their own fixed ranking system, everything in African society that did not fit that system became a problem to be removed. The river goddess, Oshun, a real expression of divine feminine authority, became demonized. The Ohema's power to determine who became king became something they had no category for and therefore just ignored. The market women's economic sovereignty became an inconvenience. The entire philosophy of complementarity, the beliefs, the governance structures, the way of organizing society around the idea that both energies were essential, all of it had to go. Because you can't build a new foundation where the existing one is still holding steady. You have to clear that first. The most visible way they did this was through religion, but there was another way that had even longer lasting effects. The administrators needed to govern vast lands without any of their own men really being on ground. Their solution was to use what they called custom. The problem was that they did not understand African custom at all. African customary practice was not a fixed rule book. It was fluid. It was negotiated. It adapted to the real needs of the community in real time. It was designed to be flexible. But these people needed something that they could write down and enforce. So they sat down with some elder men who themselves were under so much pressure in this impossible new reality, and asked them to describe how things worked. Then they wrote it down, and in the writing, everything that made the system actually work was lost. All the flexibility, all the protections for women and communities built into that system over generations, lost. They took one moment and fixed it into law. What had been an adaptable living practice then became a rigid set of rules, rules that in most cases left women with nothing they could point to or defend. This is what a large part of what we call tradition today actually is, a document, written under pressure. When I watch the gender discourse in African and diasporic communities online, I find myself genuinely troubled by it. And I understand where the anger comes from. I'm not going to pretend that it appeared from nowhere. Women have been pushed out of positions of authority, stripped of economic independence, reduced to secondary statuses across multiple spaces. That is a historical and a lived reality that continues in different forms today. But when all that pain gets directed at the man, the human gendered man, I keep coming back to the same question. Is he the actual target? Because is he not also a product of the same system? A system that raised him not to expect leadership or real partnership from the women in his life, that told him not to ask for help, that socialized him to lose sight of what a genuine counterpart looks like, someone whose strengths work with his rather than against him. We call it toxic masculinity online, manosphere. I think that's another popular word for it. But maybe what we're describing is what happens to a man who was never introduced to his own Iwa Pele, who was never shown that his strength grows when the person beside him is also fully able to express themselves and who they are, who was handed a rank and told it was a relationship. And I think about the voices that are loudly defending what they believe is true African tradition in their households, the ones who feel they are protecting something. And I want to ask, do they realize what they are actually preventing? That the structure they are holding onto is the very thing standing between their partner and everything she is capable of bringing to the family, to the lineage, to the community. Our societies thrived because these systems were not forced on us, because both energies were fully expressed. The community required it. It structured itself around it, actually. It understood that without both, something essential was missing. We traded that for a competition, and we are still running it, and nobody is winning, but our community is being impacted. Before I close this episode, let me offer a different way of looking at all of this. The anger in the gender discourse, the real anger underneath all the noise, what if it's actually just frustration? The frustration of people who feel somewhere underneath all of it that something is truly off, that the dynamic that they are inside of does not really feel right, that the competition drains them in a way that a real partnership never would. When I think about complementarity, the masculine and feminine as forces meant to move with each other rather than against each other, what comes from me is relief. And honestly, a kind of grief too. Relief because it is a truer picture of what we are, and grief because the current reality is still so far from it. You know people like this, I'm sure you do. A woman whose emotional steadiness is read as aggressive or too much, not because anything is wrong with her, but because the people around her were raised to find that quality unsettling in a woman. Or a man with a deep, natural ability to nurture, who shows it in his own way, but the people around him were raised to find it unusual in a man. These people are not rare. We know them. So the question I find myself genuinely sitting with, and I'm not asking this rhetorically, is whether we as a people can return to that balance, starting in our own relationships, our homes, beginning the repair there from the inside. Because if our ancestors built civilizations on this idea, if they put it into their understanding of the gods, into how they read the human body, into how they organized power, then that understanding is not gone, right? It's just buried. We just have to remember how to find it. This is the Afromanjaro Sessions, Stolen Frameworks. Episode 3 is called The Weaponization of Tradition. It goes directly at the dishonesty of using African culture as a shield to justify something that was never ours. We are going to trace exactly where these borrowed parts of our so-called traditions come from and what it would mean to finally put them down. I'll see you there.